So welcome to the second half of Introductory Microeconomics. So I should introduce myself. I am Giovanni, so I will be the lecturer and the instructor for 3 of the tutorials, the Monday tutorials. The other tutorials are by Noreen. So why is it that is this course taught in this strange way? Okay, do not talk whilst I'm talking. So why is it that you were in Lillian's capable hands? Quiet now, okay? And I'm taking over now. I was meant to start from week 1, but because of the immigration department's incredible speed, I didn't get my employment pass until recently. Moreover, courtesy of the Ministry of Higher Education, I didn't get my teaching permit until recently, even though I've been teaching for 6 years. So that's basically the long and short of it, okay? So from now on, it will be me. So I'm the chief examiner. So I'll be the one coordinating the assessment, the grading, and the one who makes decisions as to, are you allowed to defer tests and stuff like that? I can already tell you no. Okay, so let's start by, let me start by talking about the schedule. So for the starting today, so I've tweaked the syllabus a little bit. The order of the topics has changed. The organization of the topics is a little bit different from the one that is present in the unit guide. Okay, stop talking over there, okay? It's a little bit different. So today we'll cover externalities. It was originally meant to be externalities and international trade, but I think international trade is sufficiently important that it merits its own lecture, okay? Next week, instead of the lecture, there will be the mid-semester test, okay? The mid-semester test is not in this room. Sounds stupid, it's written there. Every year, apparently, lots of students turn up to the lecture room and they act blur. Oh, where am I supposed to take it? It's in this examination hall, 9608. Another thing, if you're not the kind of person who's good at finding places, go and scout it out in advance. You don't want to show up late just because you couldn't be bothered to figure out where it is. So go and find out where it is. In particular, because it is not, despite the name, the number is 9608, so you would imagine that it's in building 9. No, it's in building 2. It's accessible through building 2, rather, okay? So the way to access it is to take the lift up to the 6th level from building 2, and then I think it's on the left or something, okay? So go and find out. Don't show up late and miss precious marks just because you couldn't be bothered, all right? So that's super important. So the week after that, we'll talk about production and perfect competition. Then we'll talk about the cases where there's market power. The lectures in weeks 9 and 10 are basically a little introduction to what is known as industrial organization. There will be a course that focuses on this later on, if you choose to major in economics, or if that tickles your fancy. I think it's called competition and regulation or something. Okay, and then we'll talk about international trade. And lastly, I will have a lecture which is miscellaneous topics, things that I think are interesting but are not covered in the unit guide. Those miscellaneous topics will be non-examinable. You will be relieved to hear. Okay, so basically, the examinable material is 4 weeks worth of stuff from the second half. Okay, up to week 11. So basically, everything that we cover in tutorials will be examinable. Okay. Speaking of tutorials, so as I said, there are two tutors for this part of the course. There's myself for the Monday tutorial, so I will see some of you, about half of you later on today, and Noreen will be taking charge of the Friday tutorials. Okay. So today there will be the tutorial test 2. Okay. So the 3 questions that Lillian posted and so on, I hope you have prepared well for them. One of the 3 will be chosen at random for each tutorial group, okay? And then we'll continue with the tutorial after the tutorial test, which is 15 minutes. And then, we will have tutorials covering the material. The other important thing is tutorial test 3 at the end of December or the beginning of January. So if for some reason you cannot make it or whatever, you'd better tell me right away. Okay, right away. If you tell me later, I will flat out deny any request and you will get a 0. Okay, so get your act together, figure out if you're going on vacation, but obviously don't tell me you're going on vacation. Tell me something sensible, and then we can arrange something. Yep, everything clear? So that's the logistics. A little bit of protocol. I believe Lillian has trained you well. She tells me she's very strict. I don't believe it because she's a nice person. Sorry. But things will go on as usual. I post the lectures on Moodle. You saw them a week in advance. Perhaps the different thing is I am currently recording this lecture. Okay, so I will edit it and then post it. I want to post it on YouTube, but I'm not sure I am allowed. But anyway, whatever. I'll just do it. If you post it on YouTube, the good thing is, intellectual property rights, all that stuff, yeah. And I get ad revenue, not. To get any decent amount of money, you have to have hundreds of thousands of viewers, at least. And so the good thing about YouTube, you will find, YouTube has automatic subtitles. So in the past, I've realized that was something that students really value, being able to review the lecture and understand what the lecturer is saying thanks to the subtitles. Often YouTube is smarter than you in understanding different accents and so on. So I will try to finish by 10:15. I should have said here, try to finish. Not sure I will manage, so you can ask me questions individually. I know many of you are more comfortable just coming to me and asking me questions one-to-one. And also so you can get to the next class. And I will try my best to convey what I think are interesting and useful ideas. Okay, so interesting and useful. What I'm not going to do, I'm not going to just go through all the material in the textbook, section by section, and I just, parrot it out, because there's not that much value added in that. You can do it yourself. You can read the textbook yourself. It's actually quite well written. And also because I find a lot of the stuff in the textbook is not very interesting at all. Okay, it's we'll get to a discussion of the terrible state of economics as a discipline and economics education, maybe towards the end of the course. Okay, but what I'm trying to say here is there will be content that takes a slightly different perspective from what is in the textbook. Okay. But at no point I will make things any more technical than they are in the textbook. In terms of useful ideas, I will try to focus on applications, on examples, on policy questions. I think that's the area in which economics has the most value, when we can say something about, when we can describe real-world phenomena, and when we can say what should we do about undesirable phenomena. That's on my side. On your side, you should try to arrive on time, okay? Indeed. Try not to talk to others during the lecture, okay? So there are 2 times. There's one time, which is the lecture, and you're not supposed to talk to others, okay? I'm generally a relatively easygoing person, relatively, okay? I suppose it's relative to whom. But one thing I cannot tolerate is people chit-chatting, waltzing in late. Oh, hi, how was your weekend? Yeah, because it's a Monday morning, right? Oh, I got so drunk. Okay. No. Okay, if you do that, I will find a way to penalize you. So please do not do that. Don't get drunk also. That's bad in and of itself. You can talk during the tutorial. Please talk as much as you like to me, not to each other. Okay? The other thing I absolutely hate is when people start packing before I'm done. Okay? don't do that. As I said, I will try to finish early. If I don't manage to cover everything, then I will make the stuff that I haven't covered non-examinable, okay? So I promise I will try my best to give you a little bit of time, so don't start packing early. I'm still talking, gathering things, rustling of leaves, of papers, and so on. Don't do that, okay? It's very distracting. But the most important thing that you should do is you should keep a watchful eye on what I'm doing, what I'm saying, what I'm doing, and so on. If I make a mistake at any time, what you think is a mistake, just tell me, okay? It's important that mistakes don't go unnoticed, uncorrected, all right? I will find a way to reward you if you do that, okay? If I don't post something I'm supposed to post, sometimes it happens, you know, I try my best, but sometimes I forget or something, I'm in the middle of things, I don't know. So do let me know, okay? I'm only human, I make mistakes. Okay, so we talk about externalities today. Okay, it's supposed to be an application of the material that you studied earlier, but it's not. It's a thing of its own, actually. I don't know why the textbook places it as an application. Okay, so what is an externality? If you've done A-levels, you will have been exposed to this idea briefly. It's just the impact of some activity onto others, onto agents who are not directly involved in that activity, onto bystanders. Bystanders, yes. So we call it a negative externality if it imposes some kind of cost on them, okay, if it's bad for the bystanders. A positive externality if it's good for them, okay, when it imposes an external, when it generates an external benefit for them. There is a traditional classification of externalities into whether they are production or consumption externalities, okay? So that we will illustrate this classification in a second. That is, does the externality arise in the process of making something or in the process of consuming that? And of course, there is the negative and positive dimension, okay? So, classic examples of externalities, the ones that we always talk about. Negative production externality, pollution. Positive production externality, research and development. Okay, so pollution requires almost no explanation. We will talk a lot about it later on today. R&D perhaps merits some discussion. Why is it a positive externality? So suppose a firm engages in research and development, develops some new technology. The knowledge that is created from this research will, of course, benefit the firm that generated the knowledge, right? So let's say a firm, Pfizer, discovers that a certain kind of drug that they thought was going to help hypertension is actually good for treating erectile dysfunction. Okay, I'm just picking an example at random. This is not from personal experience or anything like that. Suppose that Pfizer, which this indeed happened, right? It became Viagra. So Pfizer came upon this discovery, a somewhat accidental discovery. They were actually originally looking for a better hypertension drug, drug for high blood pressure. Of course, there is protection of this knowledge. Pfizer patented it and so on. But the knowledge that a certain class of chemical compounds, which scientists thought were promising for hypertension, also have the side effect of improving the sexual lives of men, is a piece of knowledge that is difficult to contain and spills over to other firms. Indeed, after Pfizer discovered and patented Viagra, the rivals like Merck and so on patented similar drugs. Cialis, what's the other one? There's another one. Again, don't ask me why I know so much about all these drugs. So that's an example of a positive externality. Pfizer's research into hypertension drugs, which led to erectile dysfunction drugs, benefits the production of drugs of other pharmaceutical firms. Yeah, these other pharmaceutical firms, they didn't do anything about this, they just heard about it. Okay, it turns out that this is true, and that's how they benefit. So that's a classic production, positive production externality. Consumption externalities, you have negative ones. The classic one, the canonical one, is smoking. Secondhand smoke basically hurts bystanders. And a positive consumption externality is vaccination, right? So when you vaccinate your child, of course there's a benefit to the child, to your child, him or herself, because he or she is more resistant to certain infectious diseases, but there's a benefit to everybody else also, because your child not contracting the disease makes the spread, limits the spread of that disease onto others. Okay, so there are two effects. One is the effect on the child who is being vaccinated, and the other is the external benefit to all other children that this child comes in contact with, whose probability of being infected decreases slightly thanks to this particular child being vaccinated. Okay, so that's a positive consumption externality. It's often difficult to categorize, it's sometimes difficult to categorize an activity that causes externalities into production or consumption, right? There are some cases where it's not very neatly categorizable. It could be, you could think of it both as production and consumption. The typical examples are congestion, for example. Is that a road congestion, which we will discuss later on today? Is that a production or consumption externality? Okay, it's not that clear. Dangerous driving, what is that? Well, you could say it's in the process of the production of transportation services, right? But it's also in the process of consumption of transportation services. So which one is it? It doesn't matter. Okay, I will illustrate the four cases in a diagram in a second, but it's not a big deal. Okay, don't get lost in the technicalities. I don't care about those. You shouldn't care too much about those unless you're going to be doing a PhD in economics. The most important idea is this, that there are effects onto others. Okay. One more thing that I want to mention is that, I don't know, is it because human beings are that way, it's just human nature or what, but it seems much easier to think of negative externalities than positive ones, right? When you start thinking about externalities, which I will ask you to do in next week's tutorial, lots of examples, left and right. It's very easy to come up with a long list. When you're asked to think of positive externalities, then, yeah, you come up with a few and then, So I've never figured out why that is. Yeah, why is it that it's so much easier to think of negative ones? You know, I am sure you will share this this experience when you're trying to come up with examples. Moreover, for many positive externalities, it is difficult to prove that the externality exists. So there's a whole class of externalities which we will not discuss in this course because they're actually quite complicated, to do with networks, okay, to do with the benefit, a bit like the vaccination example. So there is a benefit for to others from you joining some kind of network, for doing something that is connected to others. You know, the typical examples are things like social network, WhatsApp, right? So if you have WhatsApp, then if you join WhatsApp, you sign up. I know the idea of signing up for WhatsApp it's I mean, obviously you do it, right? But you know, imagine at the beginning when it was starting up, you joining it, you opening an account, signing up, has a benefit to you, of course, because you can now communicate with others, but it also has an externality on others in the sense that it makes the network more useful to others, because now others can reach you, okay? There are all sorts of complicated issues to do with that. So I just want to put it out there. It's not examinable, okay? So I will not ask you to do anything in the exam relating to this, but just keep it in mind that there is a whole class of these network externalities, right? To do with joining things where you interact with others, which generally lead to positive externalities, but proving these externalities is very difficult. Proving the negative externality of pollution is dead easy. I mean, you can see, you can measure the particulate pollution, whatever, all of this stuff. Proving the externality of vaccination is also very easy. You can look at the rates of infection, smoking, and so on and so forth. Some of them is very hard, like network externalities, okay? Externalities are an example of what we call market failure. That's an important term. Market failure means a situation where the market outcome is suboptimal, is inefficient, okay? Doesn't maximize the welfare of the agents involved. There are other examples of market failures. So the one that we will discuss is the presence of market power. Agents being able to influence the price through their quantity decisions, that's a form of market power, and that's something that is considered a market failure and will lead to inefficient outcomes. So the two that we will cover in detail are this, externalities and market power. These are the two market failures. There are others which you will encounter in later courses. Asymmetric information is a hugely important one. When some agents in a market know something that other agents don't, that can lead to inefficient outcomes. Okay, so that's a market failure. And there are several others, okay, which, as I said, I will not discuss. So the two that we will talk about in this course are externalities and market power. Okay, so the two have something in common. So, what does it mean for externalities to be market failure? What does it mean for them to lead to inefficiency? So inefficiency means that the surplus to society, that the well-being of the agents in society is less than what it could be, okay? Less than the maximum possible. So in the categorization, it's a bit technical, but you know, if you look at it like this, you'll be blurred. You cannot possibly absorb this like this, okay? So that's, you have to go back and study this, think about it. That's the other thing, yeah? So as you will discover, allow me to patronize you a little bit. As you will continue on your higher education journey, you will realize that the days when you could just sit there and just let whatever the instructor is telling you wash over you and somehow you will automatically absorb it because you're smart enough. Of course, you know, the fact that you're here means you were smart enough at school. For that generally to happen, that's not true anymore, okay? So you will have to struggle a little bit to fully understand material now that you are in higher education, okay? So, you know, lectures are not TED Talks. You can't just sit there like YouTube videos where, it's entertaining and you just let it seep into you automatically. You have to make some effort, okay? That's why it's useful to take notes and so on. Anyway, so with externalities, what happens is that there is a discrepancy between private costs and benefits or value. The textbook calls it value. I believe Lillian used the term benefit in the earlier part of the course. The two are interchangeable, okay? When we talk about value, it just means the same as benefit and vice versa. So the problem with externalities is that the value or benefit to society of something or the cost of some activity to society differs from the value to individuals, the private value to individuals who make those decisions, and the costs, the private costs to the individuals who make the decisions. Okay, so the discrepancy between private and social values and costs is what lies at the core of the inefficiency of externalities. So in a negative production externality, you have that the social cost of the activity, so the private cost plus the external cost is greater than the private cost because there is this external cost, right? So the social cost is greater than the private cost because of the presence of an external cost. In a positive production externality, you have the reverse. The social cost is lower than the private cost. So private individuals who are engaging in this activity that generates a positive externality incur a private cost to them, but society gets some kind of benefit so that the social cost is actually lower than the private cost. The external benefit offsets some of the private costs, right? And so on with consumption, negative consumption externalities is the external value, the external cost that lowers the social value relative to the private value, and so on and so forth, okay? So all of this means that there is a difference between the market equilibrium outcome, the market equilibrium quantity being produced and consumed, which depends only on the private costs and values, right? So remember, everything we've done so far, you've looked at so far involves the case where individuals look at their costs, look at their benefits, and then they decide how much to consume and produce, right? That's how the market allocates resources, how that's the quantities arrived at, private values and costs. But now that there are external benefits and costs, the outcome for society as a whole is worse, is made worse by these private decisions, okay? Compared to what it could be if the quantity was chosen in such a way as to maximize sum of social value and minimize the social costs, okay? So the market equilibrium is where marginal private value equals marginal private cost, right? Where demand equals supply, basically. But the social optimum is where the social marginal value equals the social marginal cost. The fact that these are different means that there will be inefficiency. Now, for a negative externality, so all of this palaver, all this complicated stuff, simply translates to, for a negative externality, because of the presence of an external cost, the quantity being produced and consumed is too large. The quantity that the market reaches, the market equilibrium reaches, is too large relative to what it should be if the external costs were taken into account. Similarly, conversely, for a positive externality, the market equilibrium quantity is too low relative to what it should be if the external benefit were taken into account. Okay, so it's as simple as that. All of this is just to, and the diagrams that we see, just to make this very simple point. There's too much of a thing that generates negative externalities, too little of a thing that generates positive externalities, which makes sense. It makes intuitive sense, right? If people are selfish, they don't care about the cost they're imposing on others, they do too much of something. If people are selfish, they don't care about the benefit that they're giving to others from doing something, they do too little of that thing, yeah, compared to the case where they do take that into account. So the diagrams, for completeness, look like this. I believe the textbook does not have the diagrams. We'll draw them for completeness, but I personally don't think they're a huge deal. Okay. So we draw the usual diagrams with that you looked at in the lecture on efficiency, right? We have to look at values and costs, or benefits and costs. So we have the the situation of negative production externalities. There is the private cost, like this, right? So that's private cost. I'll call it PC, private cost. They're marginal costs, right? We will discuss next the week after in much more detail what marginal means. Basically, the cost of an extra unit, okay? The cost of the additional unit. And you have the, and this will be the supply curve. And then you have the private value, which is also equal to the social value in the case of a negative production externality. Private value, social value, they're the same because there are no external benefits. It's only external costs. The problem is that there is this external cost that causes social costs to be higher than private costs. Okay, right? So this thing is the external cost, right? So the quantity that the market, and this is demand, by the way, the quantity that the market reaches is this, let's say quantity market, MKT for market. But the socially efficient quantity is the one where the marginal social value equals the marginal social cost, okay? Where we equate not private costs and private values, right? The market equates private costs and private values, but for efficiency, we should equate social costs and social values, okay? To reach this quantity. This is the efficient quantity, yeah? Which is lower than the market quantity. Now, the fact that the market quantity is greater than the socially efficient quantity generates this deadweight loss. Yes, this little triangle here is a deadweight loss from the negative externality. These are all the external costs that, sorry, it's here. The triangle actually is here. This is the deadweight loss. Sorry, I have the luxury of erasing it without messing it up, but you don't. So, T-pex, the tape is required in this case. Sorry, the deadweight loss triangle is this one. Why? It represents all the external costs. Remember, the vertical distance between the social cost and the private cost is external cost. It represents all the external cost that doesn't generate and is not offset by any additional private value. Okay, so that's why it's this upper one. So this, if you will, this parallelogram is all the external costs from this additional quantity, but some of that external cost generates private value, right? The benefit to the consumers of consuming these extra units. So that offsets the external cost, so we're left with just this, which is the deadweight loss, the too much of the externality. Okay, a little bit technical. Don't worry too much about it. Okay, so don't worry too much about it. I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say to you. Yeah. What about other examples? Positive production. We have, now it's the other way around. Sorry. We have there's private costs, and we have private values, social values. So that's the supply, that's the demand. But the social cost is lower, right? So with the market outcome is the one where demand equals supply. Sorry, let me make this clear. But the socially efficient outcome is this. Okay? So again, we have this social, so again, we have an external cost here. Sorry, external benefit. And we have this deadweight loss caused by the external benefit that is lost, that is that doesn't accrue to anybody. Okay, and we can we can draw similar diagrams for negative consumption, positive consumption. Okay. So for consumption externalities, now the difference is in the value side, right? So private and so here private costs, which is supply. Then we have private values, which is demand, but we have this social value, which is lower. Right? The difference between these two is the external cost. I should say here that this is also social cost. This is the market outcome. And this is the optimal. Okay, we have this. And similarly for positive consumption, it's a discrepancy in the values, the private and social, so it's the reverse of the negative. So the social value is higher than the positive, than the private value. Okay, oh, by the way, this is also social cost. This is supply, this is demand. So that's the market quantity. That's a socially efficient quantity. There's the external cost, external benefit, sorry. And there is deadweight loss from the benefit that is that doesn't accrue to anybody. Okay. So go over them in the comfort of your own homes. Mull it over. As I said, not super important. It's not something I will focus on that much, but for completeness, is good to have it there. As I said, because the textbook doesn't really go through it, and also because I don't want you to later on do some course where you're told about externalities, this and that, and then say, oh, but I never seen the diagram. And then the instructor for that course will be, what kind of moron taught you introductory microeconomics? So I don't want to be labeled a moron, and hence I'm showing you this, okay? But again, not a big deal, okay? Not a big deal. Okay, so I will post this beautiful collection of diagrams on actually, I will post the exact output here online. I mean, not just the recording, but this page itself for your own convenience. Okay? Okay, how are we doing? Okay, not too bad. So now, remember, what's the message? Where are we at? What have we established? We have established that if there are externalities, the market outcome, the agents in a market, when left to their own devices, will come to an outcome that is inefficient, that is not as good as it could be in terms of social surplus, okay, in terms of the benefit minus the costs to everybody involved. That's the market failure. And when there is a market failure, there is potentially scope for improving things, doing things in a different way, and increasing surplus, increasing the benefit minus the cost to society. How can we do that? Through government intervention, possibly. So that's a situation, externalities being a market failure, are a situation where the government can improve on the market outcome. What are the tools that the government can use? There are essentially two. One very closely related to economics in people's minds, that is corrective taxes and subsidies. Yeah. And the other, which is not something that people really think of in economic terms that much, but is extremely widespread. It's in fact the dominant form of government intervention, of any kind actually, and but it is amenable to economic analysis. Okay, so corrective taxes or subsidies, what does it mean? So if you have a negative externality, tax the activity that is generating the negative externality, because as you've saw last week, taxing some activity will decrease the level of that activity, will decrease the equilibrium quantity that is produced and consumed, right? So that's one way of rectifying a negative externality. If there's too much of something relative to what is socially optimal, just tax it so that people do less of it. If there is too little of something because of a positive externality, so people are doing too little of it, subsidize it, throw money at it, give people money for doing it, and then they will do more of it. Okay, it's a simple idea. The examples are things to do with the pollution, emissions, and so on. There's in many countries now, there are taxes on, let's say, carbon dioxide emissions, essentially carbon taxes, what are known as carbon taxes. So let's say for cars, the more carbon dioxide emissions, the higher the registration fee for the car, for example. There are taxes on tobacco. That's partly to address the second-hand smoke negative externality. On the positive side, there's subsidies for certain kinds of activities like research and development. There's large government subsidies all around the world for research and development, right? And that's because it incurs positive externalities, and the belief is that there would be too little R&D if it wasn't for government intervention, government subsidies. That's a reason why governments fund universities. Okay, universities are supposed to do research, and that's supposed to generate positive externalities onto the rest of society. So governments they say, okay, let's take money from taxpayers and give it to these guys to, pay their salaries and let them do research, whatever that may be. Okay, it's not even clear that governments understand what goes on in terms of research at universities, but that's the idea. Okay. I wish we had more time so we could discuss this in more detail. It's a very interesting area, trying to understand the positive externalities from research and the government response to it, but unfortunately we can't. Okay. The other kind of intervention, as I said, is regulation. Quantity regulation is the one that will that is most relevant to the question of externalities, right? So if there's too much of something, well, the simplest response is, instead of taxing, is just, the government tells people, hey, there's too much of it, do less of it. That's quantity regulation for negative externalities, right? So a maximum level or a minimum level. Very rare for governments to impose a minimum level of something relative to the negative externalities. Again, it's this problem of negative, positive. We, lots more negative examples than positive ones. So the quantity regulation that sets a maximum for activities that generate negative externalities, lots. Pollution, right? There's targets, there's rules about that you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Smoking, right? More and more now in this country. Elsewhere already, lots of regulations, but here I think Malaysia is slightly behind other countries in terms of the level of intervention. Banning smoking in various kinds of areas, that's quantity regulation. Okay, so you go to some countries, if you're a smoker, it's very sad. I'm not, so but I can sympathize with smokers who are, they have to go into tiny little corners and smoke like huddled up together. I mean, especially in countries with cold climates, can you imagine? You can't smoke indoors anywhere now in let's say, most of the UK. Maybe your own home, yeah, of course. But if you're in an office building, you have to go outside, smoke in the designated area, which is like a little square in a windswept, desolate corner of the car park. In other countries, they have little tents. I think in Japan, they have smokers' tents now. I don't know what the tent is for. Maybe they zip it up and then you're supposed to Does that make you enjoy the smoking more? I don't think so, yeah. My dad used to smoke, and I didn't get it. Like, we would go on walks, let's say up not quite a mountain, but a hill. Around Rome, there's lots of hills, and so we go on walks, and he gets to the top and he starts smoking. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you smoking here? You made the effort of coming here to breathe cool, clean air, and now you ruin it. No, cigarettes taste so much better in clean, cool air. That's what he said. So anyway, so lots of curbs now on smoking. That's quantity regulation, okay? You can cast a lot of these regulations in terms of just setting a limit on the quantity of something. Okay, the quantity here is smoking in public places. On the positive side, mandatory vaccination is the key example of quantity regulation that sets a minimum of something, right? So you are required by law in almost all countries to vaccinate your child against certain diseases. So that's how the government intervenes, because otherwise people care only about the benefit to their child. Well, how likely is it that he's going to... So think about it like this. Most people are vaccinated already, and you think, well, mumps, measles. There's hardly any measles around. Why should I vaccinate my child? Right? He's not going to get it. Well, yes, but by... in the selfish mentality, when you just think about the private costs and benefits to you, you ignore the fact that the vaccinating your child is exactly the thing that contributes to keeping measles rates low all across, right? Because your child now will not transmit measles will not get measles and will not transmit it to other people. So you are ignoring that cost at a private level, right? So the government says, no, everybody has to be vaccinated against measles. Unfortunately, there is a bunch of morons, started out in the UK and the United States. So, developed countries are not developed in every respect. Yeah, so there are some areas in which they're pioneers in moronity. And vaccination is one of them, unfortunately, where some stupid celebrities decided to take it upon themselves to basically spread false information that certain kinds of vaccines are bad for you. Yeah, they're poisonous because they contain mercury. Of course, mercury is bad for you, but vaccines don't have mercury anymore. They cause autism. No evidence whatsoever of that. Okay, so vaccination rates are dropping in some areas. There are actually very affluent areas of the United States, certain areas in California, where vaccination rates have dipped below 90% for measles, and indeed they are getting epidemics of measles. Okay, measles now has become a common disease in childcare centers in some areas of California because the stupid parents believe these conspiracy theories and so on. I mean, there are conspiracy theories which are true. They're not conspiracy theories. For example, in some areas of Central Africa, villagers don't like their children being vaccinated. Okay, basically there are attempts by NGOs to go and vaccinate children against. No, I can't remember. I think it was polio, right? And but now many of these villagers are against it. They don't want to vaccinate their children. Okay, and why is that? It turns out that the conspiracy theory is there. Oh, this is a tool of Western domination. These guys, these NGOs who come and it looks like they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Actually, they are CIA spies and they're infiltrating us and they're doing this and that and whatever. And so it sounds like a ridiculous conspiracy theory, but it's true because the CIA had a program where they went around spying around by employing people who were trained doctors, nurses, and so on to go and vaccinate. I mean, the vaccines were real, yeah, they were helping the children. But these guys were also spies, so when, rebels, the military groups, were being targeted by the CIA in this way, like finding out where this leader is and so on, so they would cause violence and so on in those villages where there were vaccination drives. Yeah, so everybody's like, no, don't come anywhere near us. No, we know you're CIA operatives. We don't want any trouble. Just piss off, okay? The damage is done, okay? So those guys, I understand, yeah? I mean, yeah, the CIA assholes that they are, they're always messing things up. But the vaccination thing in the US and UK just doesn't make sense. But Yeah, there you have it. There, it's mandatory, but it's difficult to enforce fully. Okay, the minimum level of vaccination. So the positive externalities there are huge. You can see it immediately. Immediately, vaccination rates drop below 90%. Lots of cases of children with measles. Actually, the bigger one is pertussis, whooping cough. Yeah, you should go on YouTube and watch videos of kids, babies. Yeah, less than 1-year-old babies with whooping cough. It's heartbreaking. Okay, but they get it because the other kids don't get vaccinated and so on, and they start spreading it. Okay, so let's talk about corrective taxes. So what's a corrective tax? Also known as a Pigouvian tax. If you see that term, it just means corrective tax, okay? Because Arthur Pigou was the guy who championed these taxes like more than 100 years ago. Their taxes imposed on negative externalities. We're going to focus on negative externalities from now on. So what do they do? Well, remember, the problem with a negative externality is that the individuals engaging in some activity are not taking into account the external cost that they're imposing on others. Yeah, that's negative externality. Definition of a negative externality: the external cost imposed on others because of some activity. So how do you correct that? Well, make that external cost internal. That is, the ones who are doing the activity that generates an external cost, make them pay so that they take into account that external cost, right? I mean, they don't really take into account the external cost, right? They still don't care that their pollution is harming others. But if they have to pay for every unit of pollution a tax, then effectively it's the same as them caring, because every time they pollute, they have to pay, and it's a financial cost, a monetary cost that they're incurring. So this idea of changing the incentives, the financial incentives, to align the private costs and benefits to the social ones is called internalizing the externality, right? And I hope it's clear why it's called this. So if you see this expression, it means some form of taxation, internalizing the externality. Yeah. Now, the good thing about this, it's kind of a double whammy. It's good in two ways. First, a corrective tax, as intended, corrects the externality, but also it generates revenue for the government. So the government can use the revenue to do whatever. So under the assumption, in everything that we discussed so far, the assumption is that the government is out there to do good things. Yeah? So it's not out there to enrich themselves or anything like that. That may or may not happen in the real world. Under the assumption that the government is there to do good, to increase the well-being of society, then that revenue generated from the corrective tax is also a good thing. Yeah? So there are two positives to a corrective tax. Right? One is reducing the externality, reducing the deadweight loss from the externality, and the second is generating revenue that can be used for something. Right? It can be used to further improve outcomes. For example, if it's pollution, then the government can install treatment plants or whatever. Right? The revenue can help administer the control of pollution and so on. Or it can be used for something completely different, but under the assumption that the government is doing things for the benefit of society, that's a good thing. Yeah. Now, as you saw before, generally, taxes generate deadweight loss. Right? When the government tries to get revenue from agents in a market through taxation, it generates a deadweight loss because the quantity of the thing that is being taxed generally falls. Yeah? So that's bad because there is missed gains from trade. Right? If the quantity falling, there is the deadweight loss triangle that arises because there are units of this good where the marginal benefit is higher than the marginal cost, but those units are not being produced and then consumed, right? That's the deadweight loss from taxation. There is no such thing here because reducing the quantity is precisely the thing that improves efficiency. So a corrective tax generates revenue in a way that doesn't generate deadweight loss. If anything, it improves efficiency by reducing the deadweight loss due to the externality. So it's really a great thing, a corrective tax, okay, if set at the right level. So the diagrammatic analysis goes something like this. Suppose you have a negative externality, so you have private costs here, and that's a supply. You have private values, social values, that's a demand curve. And you originally have this problem of the social costs being higher because of the external costs, right? So the efficient quantity is here, but the market outcome, market quantity is here, right? Suppose the government imposes a corrective tax, let's do it in green. You may or may not have 4 different colored pens, but I do. I have infinitely many pens actually here. There's a continuum of colors I can use. What is this? This is private costs plus the tax. So now this distance, the green distance, is the tax, corrective tax. Now I'm drawing it like this because maybe the government doesn't quite get it right? It sets a tax that is a bit too low. It's possible. Indeed, generally it is for informational reasons that we'll get into later, but also maybe for political reasons. Maybe the government knows that the efficient tax should be higher, but they know that if they do that, they will go out of power in the next election, so they're not going to do that. Okay. So now, what is the quantity that is reached with the unit tax? So the unit tax shifts the private cost curve upwards a little bit. It increases private costs, right? The costs that the polluters, let's say, bear now are the private costs due to their technology and so on, plus the tax, right? So that aligns their incentives, their production incentives, closer to the social ones, right? Somewhere in the direction of getting close to the social costs. Now, if the unit tax, the corrective tax, were all the way up there, were exactly equal to the external cost, then great. Yeah, the problem is completely solved. But typically it won't be. It will be partially solved. So this is the quantity with the tax. I'm running out of space. Okay, I hope you can see. Okay. So the deadweight loss triangle has shrunk, yeah, from this big triangle here. This used to be the deadweight loss triangle, right? But is now, after the tax, only this small triangle. Oh, I realize there is a long delay. Okay. So what I'm saying is a little bit out of sync with. I will correct it in post in the video. Right. So the deadweight loss from the negative externality has shrunk from the red triangle to the green triangle. So that's good. Yeah, that's a good thing. But there is more, right? This tax generates revenue as well, right? Because for every unit of this good that is being produced, yeah, the government collects a little bit of this tax. So this, and how much does it collect per unit is this distance up to this quantity here. So we have this parallelogram. Why is it so slow? That is the tax revenue. Yeah. So that revenue is generated without a loss of surplus, which is great. Typically, to generate any kind of revenue, when in the absence of externalities, you incur some deadweight loss, right? You incur some reduction in total surplus. But here, it's the opposite. You increase total surplus by reducing the deadweight loss, and you generate some revenue as well. Yeah. So that's the good thing about corrective taxes. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break, 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes over. The break is over. Okay, so during the break, somebody approached me and asked me, oh, why is the tax revenue drawn in this funny way? It's okay, if you don't like this weird parallelogram, you can also draw it as a rectangle. It really doesn't matter, okay? So all that matters is that it's this height, this height. Come on. Oh, it's not showing, the laser pointer. Oh, yeah, yes, this height. Okay, I don't know why there's such a delay here. And times the quantity, right? The revenue is tax times quantity. So you can draw it in these two equivalent ways. Yeah? I suppose the one on the right is more straightforward, right? It's something that you're more used to compared to the one on the left. Okay. The deadweight loss, all of that is, of course, independent of how you draw the tax revenue. In general, I want to say, as a general guideline, I'm not particularly keen on these diagrams and all that. Yeah, especially if you're not an economics major, this is quite pointless. Yeah, to be frank. But it's part of the standard microeconomics curriculum. So I am exposing you to it. But I personally don't think there's a lot of value in this. Some diagrams, yes, but these ones, the idea is just here in the text, okay? Correct the externality, positive number 1, and generate revenue, positive number 2. Exactly how much doesn't really matter so much. But what about quantity regulation? Now, this is the bit that is, well, you might think it's less clear, the link with, like, how do we do the economic analysis of this? Well, we have to start off by thinking about what kind of quantity regulation occurs. Shh, break is over. Okay, I'm talking now. We have to think about the kind of quantity regulation that arises. There are two levels at which you can set the quantity. Like we continue with the analysis on negative externalities. And they are, in some sense, different, okay, fundamentally different. One is 0. Some activity, some externality, the government regulates it so that the allowed quantity is 0. That is, in principle, none of it should occur. Okay, and this is quite common. This is basically outlawing something, disallowing something. Use of certain class of toxic substances. In every country, the government publishes a schedule, a list of substances which, in general, you're not allowed to use in any kind of production process. Yeah? So typically think like mercury, cadmium, and so on, these heavy metals, which are known to be extremely harmful to humans. The ban on smoking in public areas, that's in a way setting a limit of 0. Yeah? In other contexts, instead of setting a 0 limit, completely disallowing something, the externality is tolerated up to some limit. Yeah? So some positive level is allowed, and that's typically the case for emissions. Yeah? So vehicle emissions, pollution of certain kinds, that's how it's dealt with. So vehicle emissions, the government regulates it by saying vehicles registered from this year onwards cannot produce more than X amount of nitrous oxides or X amount of, I think carbon dioxide here, not yet regulated like that, but for example, diesel engines, it's regulated so that the amount of particulates, sulfur and so on, sulfur oxides is capped. Okay, so the so-called Euro 6, Euro 5, Euro 6 regulations for diesel emissions. It's tolerated, basically. Yeah. The distinction between 0 and positive will matter in terms of revenue. Okay, we'll talk about it later, but I mean, briefly, the idea is that if you set something at 0, there's no way to generate revenue using this restriction, right? Because you're just not allowing it. If you set it at a positive level, you could sell the permits for polluting or whatever, for emissions that are tolerated. Right? So it's tolerated, but you have to pay to get the permit to do this. So that's a way in which you could generate revenue. Okay, we'll discuss this a little bit later. Now, you might say, well, why is it that there are positive levels? Why are externalities tolerated at all? Well, because getting rid of the externality comes with costs, right? So for some, we set the level at 0. We just don't want it to happen. But for many things, such as industrial emissions, it's too costly to society to set the level at exactly 0. Imagine if, so we all know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and it's bad. But it just doesn't make sense to set the limit of carbon dioxide to 0, right? We shouldn't even breathe. Okay, we all have to die. Extreme example, but reducing an externality always incurs costs. Right? There is a reason why the externality is there, because it's cheaper to do things with the externality than to do it without. Otherwise, why does anybody bother generating these negative externalities? If there is, assuming we have some conscience, if an polluter, if an industrial plant could get the same profits, same quantity, everything the same, but without polluting, why wouldn't they do it unless it were more costly to reduce the negative externality? So there is this trade-off that must be taken into account. Unfortunately, in a lot of discussion of externalities, this very simple concept that you should think about this trade-off is lost. How can you put a price on clean air? That's a ridiculous statement. How can you put a price on clean air? Well, we put a price on so many things. Okay? It's an emotional way of saying it. How can you put a price on clean air? Everybody has the right to clean air. Well, you should know that the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out is polluting the environment. So what are you going to do about that? The economic way of thinking is, okay, let's look at the benefits. Okay, over there, stop talking. Okay. The economic way of thinking is, think about the benefits to society of reducing the externality. Think about the costs to society, including, of course, the people who are generating the externality of reducing it. And, carry out the reduction, set the limit in such a way that the two are balanced. Right? That's the point at which you will maximize surplus. The benefits net of the costs are highest. Banning smoking in public areas. You might think, oh, well, obviously we should just ban it. Yeah, it's bad for people. Well, but banning it imposes a cost on the smokers. Right? So there is an inconvenience in that. Now you might think, oh, but they are morally in the wrong. Well, yes, that may be the case under some definition of morality, but the economic way of thinking, again, is to balance costs and benefits. Right? So there are costs of reducing the externality, which have to be set off from the benefits from reducing that externality. Okay? And the last point I want to make, a point that sometimes is lost, that quantity regulation depends crucially on enforcement. Okay, so quantity regulation with poor enforcement is hardly regulation. I mean, it seems like a trivial point to make. It's obvious. The slightly more subtle point is that quantity regulation, where the punishment is fines, is actually not that different, where the only punishment is fines, is not that different from a corrective tax. Right? You set a limit and you say, oh, if you go over the limit, you're guilty of this, and we will make you pay a fine. Well, but isn't that kind of like taxing the emissions or whatever it is that are over the threshold? So the two could be analyzed similarly, especially if the fine is, if enforcement is spotty, if there isn't 100% probability of getting caught, right, then the fine times the probability of getting caught. That's a bit like a tax, okay, that you're paying on the emissions, or whatever it is that is being regulated. So you can think of the two similarly. So therefore, quantity regulation with fines generates revenue. This is the classic conspiracy theory. Oh yes, the government imposes this regulation just so that they can fine us, right? So that the police officer can stop you and demand a fine, and then so that's to generate revenue for the government. So in that sense, the two are similar. Yeah, but we will discuss the sense in which the two are very different. The sense in which quantity regulation and corrective taxes are very different shortly. So let me focus a little bit more on the case of pollution because it's interesting. So in the case of pollution, you can reduce the externality essentially in two ways. Yeah? You can, of course, reduce the level of the activity that is generating the externality. So if you're a power plant and the externality is CO2 emissions because you're burning coal, one thing you could do is you could generate less power and therefore burn less coal and therefore generate less CO2. That's one way of reducing the externality. Another way of doing it is by changing the technology that you're using. So instead of burning coal using old plants, you can install all kinds of filters. You can use more efficient furnaces that burn less coal for the same amount of heat to generate the same amount of heat. And that will generate less CO2, for example. Yeah. So for pollution, some of the other kinds of externalities, there are two ways. So the analysis that we looked at so far is about reducing the quantity of the activity that generates the externality. So all the diagrams that we've drawn. But sometimes it's possible not just to reduce the quantity. One way is not just reducing the quantity, but changing the technology that is being used. But this technology, as I said before, is more expensive. If it's better, but it costs the same, or is even cheaper, then of course, privately, the polluter would just switch to it, right? The polluter doesn't switch to this better technology, to the cleaner technology with fewer negative externalities, precisely because it must be more expensive, yeah, to do so. So the combination of the cost of switching to cleaner technology or the foregone profits because of the reduction in activity, okay, so the power plant that burns less coal to reduce their emissions, but as a consequence generates less power and generates less profits. All of those are called abatement costs. So abatement costs it's a term that refers to all the costs incurred in the process of reducing an externality, a negative externality. Okay. So how does the tax, a corrective tax on emissions, work? Well, so again, this is another example of the internalizing the externality through a corrective tax, a specific example rather. So on the one hand, if you reduce emissions, you incur lower tax, right? Because the tax that you have to pay on the emissions, the quantity is lower. So the total amount of tax that you're paying is lower. So that's the benefit of reducing emissions. But of course, you incur higher abatement costs, right? So now the presence of this tax creates a benefit to the polluter of reducing emissions. And the benefit is the amount of the reduced tax. Right? They have to pay less tax for the emissions that they're generating. So how much will they reduce their emissions by? To the point where the savings, the additional savings in emissions tax are exactly equal to the marginal abatement costs. Right? So as always, the trade-off is between these two. When there is a trade-off between these two forces, you continue doing the thing up to the point where the additional benefit from doing this thing, in this case, reducing emissions, is completely offset by the additional cost of doing this thing, in this case, the abatement costs of reducing emissions. So what I'm talking about here is we can flip the problem. Instead of looking at the activity, in this case, power generation, right? We can look at the parallel dual activity, which is reducing emissions. Yeah, since that's the one that we care about. So reducing emissions, when we look at power generation, there will be the costs of generating power, the revenues, the benefits of generating power. The firm will match those two. When we flip the problem and look at reducing emissions in the presence of a tax, the firm will equate the marginal, the additional benefit in terms of reduced taxes in the presence of a corrective tax like this with the marginal costs of reducing the emissions, the abatement costs. Yeah. So what this means is that you can think of there being a market for emissions. So instead of the market for the thing that is being produced, in this case power, which has this byproduct of generating emissions, pollution, and so on, there's another market, which is the market for reduction of emissions. And in that market, you can do the same analysis. You can say, what are the benefits to the firm of reducing emissions? What are the costs to the firm of reducing emissions? And then there is equilibrium and so on. Yeah? A tax, basically, a corrective tax, sets a price on the emissions, whereas the quantity regulation, what it does, it regulates the quantity of, directly controls the quantity itself. So let me talk about a real-world example, which is a case where economists were really successful in explaining to policymakers how to make things work better. So this is the case of CO2 emissions. Okay. So in the mid-2000s, the European Union came to the decision that they were going to cap CO2 emissions from the biggest industrial emitters. Yeah? So the biggest industrial plants in Europe, all together, 10,000 of them, roughly 10,000 of them, had to emit up to 20 billion tons of CO2 per year. So that's the limit that they decided on. Okay? Now, then there is a question. So this is quantity regulation, a total cap on CO2 emissions for the whole of these 10,000 industrial emitters, power plants, refineries, and so on, steel works. So the question is, how do you allocate this limit of 20 billion tons of CO2? So the naive way is to just allocate it equally across all polluters. That's a moment of thought will make you realize that that's a very poor way of allocating the emission cap, right? Because surely some plants emit more than others. Some plants find it easier to reduce their emissions than others, right? So just in terms of technology. So power plants, it's there, and steel mills, there's just absolutely no way that they don't burn fuels, right? So a power plant a coal power plant, its raison d'etre is to burn coal to generate electricity, right? Imposing the same limit on them as another plant which, let's say, burns fossil fuels to generate energy, which it could otherwise get from the electricity grid, that's different, right? The firm that is just merely burning fossil fuels to generate electricity has an easy substitute. They could just go and buy it from the electricity grid. The power plant doesn't, right? So the cost of abatement for a power plant is likely to be higher. Therefore, setting the same limit on every industrial plant is a bad idea. Okay, that's obvious then. When you think about it for 5 seconds, it's obvious. And indeed, the policymakers realize this very quickly. We cannot just so there's 10,000 of them, we can't give 2 million tons of CO2 to each of the 10,000 emitters. So what do we do? Well, if you have to allocate it differently, then you have to go and do the analysis, right? You have to go and measure the costs of abatement for every industrial emitter. That's a nightmare. It would be hugely costly. It would be hugely difficult to do that properly, right? Huge incentives for the plants to misrepresent their costs. Right? Everybody would have an incentive to say, hey, look, your experts came to my plant, inspected, and they said that I should have a limit of 1 million tons of CO2 because my technology is very efficient, but actually they're wrong. My technology is not very efficient. It's very difficult for me to change it. And then there's an argument. Hopeless. That's called command and control, where the government decides everything in detail. Yeah, that's, by the way, something that governments like to do. Civil servants love this stuff, gives them power and so on. But it's terrible. This is not a good way of doing things because it requires enormous amounts of information. Okay, so what's the better way? Okay, issue the permits. So here is a question of permits, right? So there's a cap of 20 billion in total, and so there will be 20 billion permits, one for each ton of CO2. Allocate them equally to begin with, right? But let them trade with each other. Create a market where they can go and trade. This is why I was introducing the flip side of reducing emissions. So this is the market for permits. What's going to happen here? If you're an industrial emitter that has great technology that can reduce emissions quite easily, yeah, there's lots of ways of switching to cleaner technologies and reduce CO2 emissions. You have these 2 million permits, but in a way, it's too much. You are better off, because you can switch, you can reduce your emissions quite easily, just selling some of the permits on the market to somebody whose costs of abating, of reducing the emissions are very high. Vice versa, the guys who find it difficult to reduce emissions, to meet the 2 million tons of CO2 limit, yeah, they only have 2 million permits, but yeah, it would be better if they could emit 3 million. What do? They go and buy it from those guys that don't need 2 million. They only need 1 million. Right? So they can. So this trade allocates the permits properly efficiently across all the emitters, with the government not having to do anything. The government just has to sit. All the government did is set the total quota of 20 billion at the outset, distributed randomly. You could distribute it for fairness, of course. It makes sense to do it equally. But once that's done, then let the market for emission permits work its magic, and then it will be allocated efficiently. So the ones who can reduce their emissions more cheaply will do so and sell the excess to the ones who can reduce the emissions less efficiently and who want more permits. Now, the beauty of this is, but won't that lead to less emissions? No, because the cap is 20 billion. It doesn't matter who is reducing amongst the 10,000, as long as together they emit 20 billion, target achieved. So that's the key, because emissions are nameless, right? They're identityless. It doesn't matter whether it's a power plant who's emitting them, whether it's a steel worker who's emitting, it's just a ton of CO2. All that matters is reducing it in the most efficient way, that is, in the cheapest way for the industrial plants, right? And this is what emissions trading allows. Yeah? And it's an idea that tradable permits, an idea that economists came up with. Usually economists are not very useful, right? So the government officials usually complain, economists always give advice like, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Yeah, but just tell me, what should I do? Trade-offs. That's always the economist's answer. There's trade-offs. You have to consider this, but it comes with this cost. So the government official is not that illuminated by this kind of advice. But here was, hey, stop going around inspecting the plants, stop all that crap, yeah? Just go and do more important things. Just set the permits equally to everybody and let them trade. And indeed, that's what they adopted because it made sense. And it has achieved its objectives. So the question arises as to which way should you regulate? Should you regulate by setting a quantity, or should you regulate by setting corrective taxes? This is, again, negative externalities, yeah? So pollution, this kind of stuff. Now, because by choosing the right level of corrective tax, you could achieve exactly the same outcome as a quantity limit, right? If you want the limit to be, if you want the quantity produced and consumed to be lower, set a higher tax. If you want it to be higher, set a lower tax, and so on. By adjusting the tax, you can reach the same outcome as directly regulating the quantity, in principle, right? You have that lever. In practice, it's not so easy because information basically is the problem, right? With a tax, you need to know what the costs are, the cost side, and you need to figure out by how much the activity will be reduced. The quantity follows from the tax, but you need to know the relationship between the two. And what determines the relationship is the cost curve. But that's difficult. That's quite a hard problem. Of course, there is the other issue, which is that a tax generates revenue, whereas quantity regulation generally doesn't. But if the quantity is set to a positive level and there are permits, the government can also generate revenue by selling the permits at an auction, let's say. So that's a possibility. But the key distinction between corrective taxes and quantity regulation is information, right? So it depends what you know. It depends what it is that is very clear in the government's mind. If the damage done by the negative externality and the cost of reducing this negative externality are very clear, then quantity regulation is efficient, is appropriate, right? Suppose you know that this is the limit that we need, because if we go over this, then it's going to be terrible, and we know it's going to be terrible. And the government also knows that it's not so costly to reduce it up to that limit. Then they should go for quantity regulation. Should say, hey, this is the amount that you're allowed to, amount of this negative externality that you're allowed to generate, and that's it. This is okay because you know both sides. You know the damage, the benefit to imposing the limit, and the cost to imposing the limit. You know both, and you can set the right quantity. For example, these heavy metals. They are completely banned because the damage done by the heavy metals is very, very clear. There are historical instances where mercury leached into waters, then I think Minamoto disease, so this case in Japan where there was a plant that was using mercury, it went into the river, local river, fish became contaminated, people ate that fish and they developed severe health problems, children were born with deformities and so on. And then this was studied in depth and it became absolutely clear that mercury is terrible for humans, okay? The cost was the plant had to use an industrial process that doesn't use mercury. But that's not that bad. It's possible to switch to mercury-free industrial processes relatively easily. So that's a situation where it's efficient to ban mercury use, industrial mercury use, right? Very heavy external costs, low abatement costs, known abatement costs. It's not like they had to come up with some completely new technology that nobody has heard of. Instead, there was this mercury-free industrial process that they could use, and they could just switch to it. But if these quantities are not clear, if the abatement costs are not clear, for example, the damage done is not clear, then a tax might be more appropriate. Because the beauty of the tax is that it equalizes the marginal abatement cost to the tax. That's the point until which the reduction in the emissions, the reduction in the externality is done, right? So when there's a corrective tax, you keep reducing it until it's not worth reducing anymore in terms of the tax savings. So what the corrective tax does effectively sets an upper bound on the marginal cost of abatement. If you set the quantity really high, you could end up incurring huge abatement costs. Sorry, the quantity really low, sorry, the other way around, really low. If the government says, no, you cannot, the CO2 emissions have to be very, very, very low. It could be very costly to get to that level. Instead, if you say, okay, there are these, this tax per ton of CO2, then the government knows that nobody's gonna incur too high costs because they're not gonna incur the costs if they outweigh the benefit in terms of tax reduction. Okay, so it's a question of information when you do one or the other. When everything is clear, quantity. When things are not clear, corrective tax at least controls the abatement costs. I want to talk, shall I talk about road congestion? It's interesting, but you can skip it. Yeah, Okay, let's skip to stick to the 10-15 timeline. I was going to talk about road congestion. You can read about it. Skipping it means it's not examinable. Okay, I will not ask you any questions about road congestion in the exam. But if you're interested, do go and read that. And if you're very interested in this, do go and take courses in urban economics, transport. Can you turn that off, please? My God. Basic decency, man. So I want to talk about, in the remaining 5 minutes, alternative ways of dealing with externalities, especially negative externalities. So the discussion so far has been government doing this and that, regulating the quantity, setting a corrective tax. Well, there's another way, which as economists we often don't think about very much, but we should, which is social norms. A lot of negative externalities are mostly corrected or kept under control through just social norms, through shared beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, yeah? Without explicit government intervention. There's things like, littering, dangerous driving. Depending on the level of enforcement, it varies between how much is it a social norm, how much is it a government intervention in terms of setting a limit effectively. There are some where there is no government control, right? So, it's polite, we consider it polite to cover our mouths when we are coughing or sneezing. Yeah, but there's no government official from the Minister of Health going around, hey, you're not covering your mouth. But, that's a negative externality, coughing onto others' faces. You go to, of course, you don't have children, so, but I do. So you look at childcare. Oh my God, it's terrible. No wonder kids get sick all the time. Like these kids, they haven't internalized the social norms yet, right? They're like 3, 4 or something. So they're coughing literally in each other's faces. It's like they pick their nose, snot-covered nose, and then they touch and then so it's, but we as adults, we have this social norms. No, this is not right. You don't cough in somebody's face, yeah? you try to cover yourself. Using offensive language, stuff like that, oh God, like this kind of look of disapproval and so on. That's what keeps things under control. The noise is a bit of a gray area. And as I said, even in those cases where there is government intervention, there is a regulation, social norms, if the government intervention is so poor, then social norms are basically the thing that is driving things. I mean, given the effective level of enforcement of traffic rules here in Malaysia, you could drive like a madman. Everybody could drive like a madman and not get caught, okay? But when you drive, you think, okay, look, I'm not going to be a complete asshole. I'm gonna be a decent human being and use my indicator lights, okay? That's a social norm, because you talk to your friends and say, hey, but why'd you drive like that? I mean, it's a bit, So they're very important, these social norms. You think of many negative externalities, and we as economists tend to focus on these, government intervention, but actually there's a lot that's going on that is implicit, like this. It's tacit shared values. Obstructive parking, right? I mean, the DBKL and I don't know, what's the council here called, whatever. They can hardly be bothered to clamp cars and so on, right? So, but again, it's about shared values. It's about, maybe the social norm can extend in this day and age, social media, right? So you take a video, picture, or whatever, you post it, and so the fear of being scolded online is something that stops you from parking in the middle of a roundabout. There's a roundabout near where I live, Ampang Hillier Circle. It's just crazy. The Myanmar consulate was there. Thank goodness they moved. And people and Seyful International School is there. At certain times, there are people parked in the middle of the roundabout. How can that be a decent thing to do, right? So, in this day and age, people would take a picture of that, post it online, says, what kind of asshole does this? And here's a registration plate of this car. Go and dox him, find out who his wife, his children, and this is what we're doing. I'm not saying it's a good thing, it comes with costs. I'm saying that there are alternative mechanisms other than government intervention. But there is an interaction with government intervention. The interaction is this. very poor enforcement of regulation, in a way, sends a signal. It erodes the social norms, right? If, the few instances when it's a virtuous or vicious circle, depending on which way. If obstructive parking is, really heavily enforced, strongly enforced, then it becomes an embedded norm in people that they are not going to park like that. Yeah? And then it becomes easier for the government to catch people who do that because it doesn't happen that often. Vice versa, if it happens all the time and government doesn't do anything about it, well, then everybody's like, yeah, everybody's doing it. It stops being a social norm at all. Okay? Unfortunately, it's difficult then to reverse this. So my point here is that the interaction between the two is that once enforcement becomes sufficiently poor, then it becomes this vicious circle of poor enforcement, erosion of social norms, which makes it more difficult, more instances of this happening, more difficult to enforce, and so on. Yeah. And, okay, give me 3 minutes. The last thing I want to talk about is, so we said government intervention one way, social norms another way. Yeah. The third way is private agreements, decentralized agreements, agreements where there's nobody to impose rules or taxes or something, where people just get together and decide, hey, let's resolve this issue. Okay. The tutorial question 2 next week will be about this. Okay. So we can go into more details there. The point I want to make is this, that people can come to some kind of agreement. Typically, if the costs of coming to an agreement are low, if it's easy to get together and discuss, right? Now, one area in which it looks like the costs are huge is international agreements. If there are externalities which affect many countries, then there is no global government. The UN is not a global government. It doesn't have the power to impose, to regulate the quantity of things, and certainly not in the case of climate change, right? So what countries have to do? They have to get together and all agree to do something for, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced. So the classic case is the Kyoto Protocol for greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a complete failure. There's no other way to describe it. It's a failure. The major polluters have no limits set on them. Even the ones which originally were supposed to have some limits never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So, it's not going anywhere, right? The United States, Canada, and of course Russia, China, all of these guys, there's no limits on how much the greenhouse gases they emit. Why? And usually people come up with a list of, because there's many countries, they have different interests, blah, blah, blah. It's difficult to negotiate, it's costly to negotiate. So the impression one gets in the usual layperson talk that you hear about such agreements is, it's very difficult for countries to come to an international agreement. No, it is difficult to some extent, but it's impossible rather. People talk about, it's impossible to come to an agreement. That's not the case. It is possible. There are cases where this has happened under certain conditions. So the best example is the Montreal Protocol on CFCs, okay, chlorofluorocarbons. They are a class of gases that were used in refrigeration mostly, okay, air conditioning, fridges, and so on, which were discovered to have a huge effect on the ozone layer, UV radiation, cancer rates, and so on and so forth. But countries came to a universal agreement. It is one of the, I think it was the first universally ratified UN treaty. Why? What made it possible to come to an agreement to ban CFCs, but very difficult to come to any kind of agreement regarding CO2 emissions? Well, the damage done by CFCs was very clear-cut. Scientists, it was very visual. There was this thing called the hole in the ozone layer. It's still there, but it's shrinking. And it was very vivid. It was very easy to understand what was going on. The CFCs were going up into the stratosphere. They were breaking down the ozone. And now there is this hole where UV radiation is coming straight through. Okay? And now we need to put lots of sunscreen. The CFCs were used in a select few industry. It's not a gas that is used in everything, unlike CO2. Right? CO2, you emit it, as I said, we breathe out CO2. Cows fart methane. Greenhouse gases are everywhere. So limited use of the CFCs, so only certain industries. So the ones who were protesting against the agreement were just a few chemical companies. And there was an easy replacement. So the very chemical companies who were protesting so much actually found out it was quite easy to switch to something that was not a CFC in refrigeration and so on. So that was a successful agreement. Kyoto, greenhouse gas emissions, not so successful because the opposite in every one of these dimensions occurred. The damage is not clear-cut. There are many people who think that climate change is not a big deal. Oh, well, you know, maybe we'll get a bit warmer in Russia. What's so wrong with that? In Siberia. The costs imposed are on lots and lots of industries, not just a few. Yeah? And the costs are high of switching to less CO2 emitting processes. So bear this in mind, yeah? When you hear these very pessimistic views about international agreements, actually there are certain conditions under which it is possible to come to an international agreement, a decentralized agreement. Okay, so let's stop here.